Thank you very much. I told Mark that I would actually introduce myself a little bit, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what kind of thing I do, which is most important. I study brain function, and I particularly study a structure in the brain called the corpus callosum. So the image on your right is a normal brain, ostensibly normal. That's my brain. And you're looking at a mid-sagittal view, and the structure I study is that thing that looks like the head of a ball-pen hammer right in the middle of the brain. It's called the corpus callosum. It's 200 million neurons that connect the right and left cerebral hemispheres. And you're looking kind of at an end view, as if you took a cable and cut it and then looked at the wires at the end. You're looking at an end view of 200 million neurons transversing right to left. The individual on the right is a person with agenesis or absence of the corpus callosum. That is a congenital brain abnormality where the corpus callosum never developed. So now you have a little training in radiology, neuroradiology. You can recognize agenesis of the corpus callosum. Yeah, I've seen that before. And we study these individuals in my lab with my students here at Fuller, and we're interested in the cognitive and psychosocial outcome of this disorder. Interestingly, they can be fairly normally functioning, fairly high functioning, even without 200 million neurons that go back and forth between the right and left cerebral hemisphere. Really interesting thing to study. But of course, I do this at Fuller Seminary, and so being part of the Travis Institute, but here at Fuller Seminary, lots of questions arise about the relationships between science and faith, science and religion, science and theology, particularly neuroscience and understanding of theological anthropology, what we understand about individual persons. And so I get into conversations and events like this mostly because I do this kind of work here at Fuller. The objective of what I want to do is to explore the implications of a new view of mind called embodied cognition for understanding preaching and the nature of belief and Christian formation. So I'm going to go a little bit different direction. I want to take the science and take it to studying preaching or thinking about preaching, formation, and belief, and then we can see what that contributes to our understanding of preaching and science. So I want to ask questions like, what can current ideas in cognitive science and neuroscience reveal about what is going on during preaching? What is the nature of belief? And how does or does not preaching shape belief? What is the nature of Christian formation? And how does preaching foster formation? The theory I want to talk about or talk from or use is what's kind of dominated cognitive psychology over about the last 20 years. And it's a theory called embodied cognition. And the premises of this theory is that mental processes are rooted in sensory motor interactions of the body with the world. So mental processes, mind, is rooted in sensory motor interactions of the body with the world. So all aspects of mind, or minding, all aspects of cognition are shaped by the nature of the body. And this is the view that now, and I'll try to explain some of that view to you. Now, by cognition, I mean all of the high-level complex processes of mind, including the conscious activity that we are aware of, like thought and planning and problem solving and memories that come to mind, and language, both spoken and our kind of inner dialogue when we talk to ourselves inside, awareness of our subjective feelings and our beliefs, as well as unconscious parts of mind, memories, habits, emotions, automatic behavioral planning, and beliefs. You'll notice that some of the same terms occur in both lists. They're both things that we do consciously and unconsciously. My point is that when I'm talking about cognition, this is not synonymous with rational or conscious. but it's all the complex things we do. So embodied cognition is about the embodiment, or the way we use our bodies and the way our bodies form all the parts of our mind. Let me give you an illustration. We've had elephants already, so we'll go to elephants again. In our church, the children sing that song, "If I Were an Elephant," thank God for my large trunk, or whatever it is. If I were an elephant, but had the brain of a human, I would have a very different mind. If I were an elephant, but had the brain of a human, I would have a very different mind. And that's because mind comes about by interaction with the world. Therefore, the nature of the body influences the nature of the mind. What kind of body I have influences how I understand the world. So to explore the world with my hands gives me one kind of information about the world and forms my mental processes in one way and differently than if I explored the world with a trunk. So the construction of the mind is formed by the nature of the body. And that also includes our understanding of basketball and the NBA and whatever. Playing basketball with your trunk would be very different than with your hands and feet like we do. So that's an illustration. Now let me give you an experimental example. This is one of the important experiments in all of recent neuroscience, and it's an experiment that demonstrates a thing called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are neurons that respond in the same way, both during a motor activity, down in B below, and while viewing the same activity. So then in this experiment done in Italy by Rizzolatti and others, on the bottom here they had an experiment where there were electrodes in the motor cortex of a monkey. And what they wanted to know was, what did the motor cortex of the brain do when the monkey did a simple activity like reach to pick things up? So each one of these lines is trial with time moving this way, and each one of those little blips is a firing of a neuron. So every time the monkey reached, the neurons that the electrodes were in would fire as a registration in this experiment of the fact that those neurons were participating in the reaching. So then that happened, same neuron, trial after trial, very consistent thing. Inadvertently, not planned, while the monkey was hooked up, and these electrodes, part of the way you monitor what you're doing is put them through in a speaker, so every time the neuron fires, you get a little sound of a blip, a little buzz. And inadvertently, the experimenter happened to have reached in the same way to pick something up, and the monkey's motor neurons went zzz. And every time the experimenter went to pick something up, the monkey who was watching the experimenter's motor cortex acted as if the monkey were picking up something himself. There was a mirroring of the motor activity of the experimenter by the motor cortex of the monkey. Got that? Those are called mirror neurons. So the conclusion is, how did the monkey make the cognitive recognition of actions, that is, and presumably the intentions of the experimenter? The monkey did it by modeling the actions of the experimenter in his own motor system. All right? So the implications are, we understand the actions of others by modeling their actions in our motor systems. So if I want to know what you're doing when you're doing something, when you're sitting there typing on a little thing, I think about, what would I be intending to do when I'm doing that? I would be intending to type something into my computer, and therefore I understand you by modeling you in my motor system. That's the mirror neuron system. And this has been demonstrated not just for visual motor, but also for auditory motor, olfactory motor, somatosensory motor, pain. A number of different areas have been demonstrated to have this mirroring process. And in fact, this is just for the visual motor system. In fact, there's a number of areas of the brain that can be demonstrated to have this mirroring kind of activity. In the frontal area that actually controls the hand, in a posterior area that represents space, and in a temporal area that represents yourself and your own movement activity. So this idea of mirror neurons is an example or an experiment that's kind of important and critical and central to the idea of embodied cognition, although the theory of embodied cognition predated it by some time. So mirror neurons, what do they account for? What have they been used to account for? They're believed to be the basis of action comprehension. That's what we just saw. I comprehend your action by my mirror system running the same motor program that I would have to run if I were doing what you're doing. But it's also action anticipation. So what if I said, who goes first? And, oh, okay, let's decide. What am I going to do? Rock, paper, scissors. So knowing that we're deciding something, I go like this, you have already in your motor system anticipated my next move. And you can demonstrate in mirror neuron systems that the anticipation of action causes motor activity to be generated that not just sees the action but anticipates the action. Speech perception. The speech signal is way too variable for us to ever understand it in an auditory manner. We can't hear speech alone and understand it. You think about the number of pitches of voices, the number of accents, a deep Southern accent versus a Boston accent versus a native German speaking English. We understand these all quite well, yet the auditory signal is incredibly variant. There's no way we could do that just on the basis of auditory systems. So speech scientists have decided that how we listen to speech is to model your speech musculature in my motor system. So the only way I know what you're saying is to track what you're saying by knowing what I would be doing if I were making that sound. And knowing what I would be doing with my musculature to make that sound, then I know what phoneme you just said, even though you said it with a deep Southern drawl. We track each other's speech by running a parallel modeling of the articulatory mechanisms that go into that person's speech. Empathy. There's a lot of really good, interesting experiments in looking at the brain patterns of a person feeling pain versus the brain patterns when their friend is in the lab and is getting shocked the same way you just got shocked. The brain system of the person who didn't get shocked but their friend just got shocked gives you the same patterns of neural activity as if I got shocked. So empathy is a mirroring of your pain and distress in my nervous system, in my bodily sensory motor systems. Theory of mind. This is a theory of how do I know what you're thinking. We can't have social interactions without have some representation of what the other person is thinking as we're talking to them. And the way I understand what you're thinking is to run a behavioral model in myself of what you are thinking, what you know, of what I would be intending if I had that body posture or if I had that voice and intonation and so forth. Imitation, if we are modeling the interpersonal world, at least with our motor systems, then our motor systems are primed to do what you just did. And in fact, you can show in multiple psychological experiences the incredible amount to which we mirror each other and imitate each other in social interactions. You know, contagious yawning is the obvious one, but there's just all kinds of demonstrations of that kind of imitation of one another. The point of all this is that these are ways of understanding the world that are perceptual motor. We use our bodies to understand the world. We use our bodily memories of our bodily interaction in the world to understand the world. I'll tell you in a minute what might be the opposite of that. So those are, that's some of the theory. This is a similar argument made by Donald Mackay. I spent a year with Donald Mackay while he was giving his Gifford lectures, which came out in a book called Behind the Eye. And in that book, Don talks about belief being a conditional readiness to reckon, by which he means if I believe something, then I have a conditional readiness to reckon with the subject of that belief should the relevant conditions arise. So it's a conditional readiness to reckon. If I believe something, I am physically ready to interact with or reckon with the subject of that belief should the relevant conditions arise. Belief is not an abstract idea presumed to be true, but belief is a readiness to act in relationship to the object of belief. Belief is about the likelihood of situated action. Okay? Now, I just want to inform you that LeBron James is sitting out in the vestibule, and he'll be out there to sign your autographs and meet you and shake your hands. How many believe me? Nobody. If you believed me, you would be conditionally ready to encounter LeBron James in the vestibule, should you go in the vestibule. In fact, you'd probably jump up and run in the vestibule if you believe me. So a conditional readiness to reckon, a belief is a conditional readiness to actually act in relationship to that, whatever it is. It's not an abstract assent to something as being sort of abstractly true, but it's a readiness to act. Anybody know what this is a picture of? Dalmatian. How many people don't see it? You see the Dalmatian? See the dog? Here's his head. He's kind of facing away from you, his ears. Here's one front leg and another front leg, and that's kind of the back and the belly and the back legs. You see the Dalmatian now? Mackay argues that this is not just an abstract assignment of the idea dog to this picture, but it is in fact a perceptual response, a matching response, in which we take all the things that we know about dog and we match them to that picture, to where from now on we understand that picture or relate that picture to our world of understanding of dogs, a perceptual matching response. So I've given you an illustration in the elephants. I've given you an experiment, given you some arguments here. Now let me give you the basic principles of embodied cognition. And I'm going to take these, and I'll just tell you in a minute, I'm going to take this part directly into our understanding of belief and formation. But first of all, the principles of embodied cognition. First of all, cognition is for action. The basic problem of the mind is, what should I do? The basic problem of the mind is, what should I do? So cognition is for action. The second principle of embodied cognition is that cognition is situated. That is, doing is always in some life situation. So it's doing but not doing randomly. It's situated doing. It's doing within some context. So what the mind is about is, what do I do in this context? Or in some context, a context I might imagine. Cognition is always time-pressured. Doing is sequential. It unfolds in time. Even thinking is sequential, thinking in the sort of linguistic sense where I might sit in my chair and kind of work through a problem in my mind. It's time-pressured. It's sequential. It moves. It's not inert. And the question of the mind is, what leads to what? Action, and therefore cognition, is enmeshed in recurrent situational feedback. doing or acting is a contextually dynamic, interactive game. All right? Acting, doing, is a contextually dynamic, interactive game. We start the game and we're constantly getting feedback, and so it's a very dynamic operation. Another important one is the meaning of language is rooted in sensory motor experiences. Semanticists, linguists interested in semantics, and philosophers interested in semantics have always had this question, how do we relate a word to some abstract idea? Well, what embodied cognition says is that the meaning of language is rooted in our sensory motor experiences, sensory motor experiences we have that include the linguistic interactions and the things. So a child's learning of the semantic idea of a doll is to have the word doll and have the sensory motor interactions of the doll. So what the child has semantically is the sensory motor memories held by or held with a word. I know what the word cell phone means, cell phone here, because I have a history of interaction with this. And I picked this out because if you said in your preaching 20 years ago the word cell phone, nobody would have known much what you were talking about, and certainly not had any semantic depth to understanding the idea of a cell phone. Now you say cell phone and everybody knows what you're talking about because they have a world of interactions with this in a behavioral, interactive, tactile sense. And lastly is that, next to last, offline cognition is thinking without doing, or thinking without doing is nevertheless body-based. So we have the ability to run emulations or simulations of activity in the world that are that we don't actually express, but we run a simulation of it. So when I'm thinking, often I'm thinking linguistically, and I'm running a simulation of a conversation. It may be a conversation with myself, or it may be a hypothetical conversation with somebody else, but it's a body-based simulation or emulation of actual activity in the world. And then lastly, some cognition is offloaded into the environment. Andy Clark, a philosopher of mind, has said, we make the world smart so that we can be dumb in peace. Dumb people like me become smarter by interacting with a cell phone. So we make the world smart so that we unload some of our intelligence into interactions with artifacts in the environment. So I'm only intelligent in that way when I have available to me the artifacts which elicit my behavioral repertoires that represent my intelligence in that area. So what is the opposite of embodied cognition, just to make it even clearer? A couple of things. First of all, the opposite of embodied cognition is the idea that mental life is based on the inner manipulation of abstract symbols. It's a computer model of mind. For a long time, we've had a computer model of mind. In this model, sensory and motor systems are merely input-output buses. Information comes in, is symbolized in some way, the important things are what happen inside, and then information goes out, and the computer model is to think that the things we sense in the world and our motor interactions with the world are merely input-output functions. Information to be processed must be converted into some kind of an abstract symbol, like a string of digits. Thinking can therefore be distanced from perceiving and doing, and that's really the important thing. The computer model of mind has been thought about almost like the sandwich model. You have two pieces of bread, the input and output stuff, which is really, really irrelevant. What's really important about the sandwich is all the stuff that happens in between. And the embodied cognition says that, in fact, perceiving and doing is the essence of our mental life. So from the computer model, or the opposite of embodied cognition, to change belief, a person needs new abstract ideas. Right? So to change belief, we need to give a person new abstract ideas. Let me now take our characteristics of embodied cognition and take them directly into the focus that we have today and in this conference on preaching, and for me particularly the role of preaching in formation of belief and Christian formation generally. What I would say then in translating this is believing and formation are for action. Believing and formation are for action. They're not inert thoughts. They're not sentimental emotions experienced independent of action. Secondly, believing and formation are situated. They're relevant to life situations. They are not distanced from our situated life. Thirdly, believing and formation are time-pressured. They involve whole action scenarios. It's not just what I'm thinking about now, but it's now and what I do now and that leads to and what that leads to and what is the whole scenario of my action in the world. And it's again, an idea of what leads to what. Fourthly, believing and formation are enmeshed in recurrent situational feedback. We are continually reformed and re-believe as we get continued feedback and interaction with the environment, particularly with the environment that is the body of Christ, the church. Meaning of the language of belief is rooted in sensory motor experience. And to the degree that preaching is sort of eliciting or giving forward the language of belief, for it to have meaning, for it to have a semantic depth, that depth is rooted in action, sensory motor experiences. Offline believing, meditation and prayer, is body-based simulation and emulation. What I do when I'm meditating and praying is I am eliciting or doing it on the basis of memories of prayer that I have learned throughout my life, and people I pray with and people that have prayed for me or in my presence. And lastly, some believing and formation are offloaded into the community of believers. Christian faith is not about what I believe entirely, or it's not entirely about how I am formed. It's what we believe and how we are formed that I think are primary. So it's not, I don't have to carry just like the cell phone and my sort of offloaded intelligence, my somewhat offloaded faith is faith that is in the community in which I inhabit and which scaffolds around me in my weakness of belief and poor level of formation. I don't personally have to be fully and completely formed or have full and complete and perfect belief. So let me now go back to what we've been thinking about. If embodied cognition is true, what is to be said about preaching? how does or does not preaching shape embodied belief and body action knowledge? What embodied knowledge do congregants bring to preaching out of which they comprehend what is said? And how does such embodied knowledge get shaped? And you know what? I don't have the answer to those questions. But I'm thinking a lot about it. Been thinking a lot about it with respect to our own congregation and the life that we lead. But I have thought about kind of some domains of problem that I would like to suggest. How are we doing on time? Problem number one is that preaching is on its own relatively weak in shaping persons in comparison with embodied life. So to radically reform persons requires extended lived experience as well as preaching. Let me give you an example. I think I've got time for this. So the theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was an 18th century German theologian, was concerned about the problem of how we might learn to be persons whose lives include compassion, particularly habits of benevolence on behalf of the poor. The problem, he noted, is that neither contemplation of one's own privileged status nor reflections on one's moral obligations, which often come to mind during preaching or teaching, elicit motivations in us that are sufficient to give rise to a meaningful quality and quantity of compassionate action. The motivational power of pure obligation is insufficient. So Schleiermacher, he wrote this when he was 19 years old, I think. Schleiermacher's solution to the problem was through a combination of what has been translated sociable connections and small group action. Compared to solo compassionate action, the small group mode not only has the benefit of being more effective, more people doing stuff, kind of nets more in the work that's being done, but the group action simultaneously strengthens the intensity of the motivations of those performing the benevolent acts. Within the groups of persons engaged together in caring for persons in need, an important new dimension comes into play, the reciprocal imitation and strengthening of compassion as we are living this together. Theologian Michael Welker describes Schleiermacher's basic idea in this way. Welker says, complex and strengthening sentiments arise in me when my action is embedded in an interconnection with the actions of other human beings. Corporate embodied action is the key factor. So we are formed and reformed by observing and imitating one another as we together are involved in the life of the kingdom and in compassionate ministry. So what Schleiermacher recognized was just the moral obligation created by teaching and by just contemplating one's own privileged status isn't really enough to get us there. What we need to do is go out and do these things together. And it begins to form in us a bodily understanding of what compassionate action means. So that's one problem I see and one way I've thought about it. The second problem is, I've already indicated this, the semantics of the sermon are rooted in bodily life. And everyday life, including secular culture, shapes our understanding. So if whatever is said in preaching, the root meanings, the semantics lying under that is nested in our life in the world, and to some degree shaped by the secular culture in which we live. And an example of that, I think I have time for this, so is a study done by Mark Allen Powell, sort of a semi-experimental study. I'm sure some of you have read this. He had seminary students read the story of the prodigal son and then ask them, why does the young man end up starving in the pig pen? American seminary students answered, he wasted his money. Russian seminarians in St. Petersburg, where 670,000 people had died of starvation during the siege by the Germans during World War II. So seminary students in St. Petersburg says there was a famine. And seminary students in Tanzania said because no one gave him anything to eat. So the context out of which preaching is understood, the semantic background, is related to one's embodied life. So let me just give a conclusion to this, and then maybe we have time for a question or two. Christian belief and formation demand constant interaction between what is said in preaching and a radically different congregational life that embodies the gospel and informs in persons new sensory motor experiences, memories, perceptions that comprehend the gospel. To understand, to believe, to be formed is to have one's embodied cognition transformed. All right, thank you very much.